I know there's a lot to talk about, but it's time that we started. We have a wonderful crowd, and I welcome you all. This is one of those days when I turn the mic over to a more qualified person than I to introduce the speaker. Objectivity helps, in my view, and I believe that a wife doesn't necessarily have that feature. So, but before I call our dear friend and colleague Hal Bailey to do the honors, I'll just remind you of some upcoming programs. We have some extraordinary ones coming up. I'll just mention two now. On October 18th, to talk about appropriate, Judge Tom Vanaski will speak on cybercrime. We've heard a lot about that recently, and he is an expert on it. Unfortunately, it's all too popular, relevant a topic, but he'll handle that at lunch on October 18th. Then on November 12th, on a lighter note, the post-election R&R, that's our trip to Philadelphia. And it's November 12th, Saturday. It's a bus trip to attend one of the nation's finest craft shows and a visit to the Locks Gallery, one of Philadelphia's finest galleries. So we hope to see you there and in all our other programs. And now I'll turn the mic over to Hal Bailey.
Thank you, Sandra, and let me add my welcome to all of you to today's Schemel luncheon, World Affairs luncheon. The Schemel program is doing a bang-up job. Sandra is really a wonderful leader for this, and it's nice to be able to say that in front of an audience of old friends and people who have been stalwart supporters of Schemel for now years. So again, welcome to today's discussion. I have to back up a little bit and give a little perspective on this. A long time ago, I entered the galaxy of Scranton. And after a year or so, we bought a house. The house itself was neat, very nice little house. But the great thing about the house, as it turns out, the life-changing, in a way, thing about the house was the backyard. Because when we went out in the backyard, we met a couple over the backyard fence and the lilacs, at least I think they were lilacs. And that couple is Sandra and Morey. All right, so you can imagine what I thought Scranton was when among, the first people I meet in my new neighborhood are Sandra and Morey. Sandra, the dynamo. Sandra, the woman with the Rolodex that wraps around the world, with friends and places from Scranton, of course, to Harrisburg, to D.C., to Prague, to Bethlehem, to Jerusalem, to Rwanda. She's the one that, as Morey has put it on a number of occasions, he gets to follow around. But it's Morey that I'm actually here to talk about. I just wanted to remind you of that. He was snoozing over here. And I won't drag it out because you came here to hear him, not me. As that points out, he's a lawyer, big surprise, of remarkable accomplishments and remarkable commitment over his whole career. From civil rights legislation or civil rights work in Florida, Mississippi, and other places 50 years ago, to now he's of counsel. And to find out what that is, I understand 4 of his colleagues are here today. I actually had to look it up myself. So to be of counsel is something analogous to an emeritus professor, although from what I understand, you still get to show up in the office and comment on the work of your colleagues. And of the legal stuff he's done, 2 things in particular impressed me. and are worth noting. He is accepted to argue cases before the Supreme Court, which strikes me as good as it gets in the United States. And he has been recognized by his peers as a distinguished lawyer for 2016, an AV preeminent lawyer. There's nothing better, of course, than to be recognized as among the best by your peers, because they're the ones that actually know what you're talking about and know what you've accomplished. So we're here to hear a very distinguished man speak. But about what? One of the most impressive things I've learned about Morey is his ability to listen. He's one of the best listeners I know, whether it's at their square table in their house or just actually sitting here at the table talking about what's going on. Morey's a listener. But I want to push it a step further. What makes him such a good listener is that Morey asks the best questions of anyone I know. He's very, very careful, very, very thoughtful in how he'll phrase a question, how he'll match the question to whoever he is that he's talking to, how he'll match the question to the larger discussion for the whole group. And it's the ability to ask the right questions that makes you a great listener, because then what you've got going is a conversation with someone on the best things that they can talk about. And I think it's a privilege for all of us today to be able to hear now Morey ask himself questions about the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And it's timely because, of course, the wannabe vice presidents last night squared off. And if you thought that was bad, Hamilton and Burr got worse. And I think we're about to hear why, in fact, that worked out the way that it did. So without any further ado, it is my honor and delight to invite Morey Myers to the podium to take over for today's World Affairs Luncheon.
Thank you, Hal. Incidentally, that house with the backyard is now occupied by someone who might be as equally preeminent as you, that's Senator Bob Casey. Thank you for that superlative crafting of a substantially exaggerated introduction. But I realize that you're a substitute for the traditional presenter, and that would have been a more balanced and critical review. So there it says up there, the most dramatic moment in the politics of the early republic. I didn't say that. Henry Adams said that. And let's remind ourselves, who is Henry Adams? Who was Henry Adams? He was the grandson of John Quincy Adams, the great-grandson of John Adams, and in his own right, generally recognized as the leading American historian in the last half of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. And why did he say that? Well, let's go to the end. It's July 11th, 1804, 5 o'clock in the morning. Two boats are leaving the port of New York. One from Upper Manhattan and the other from down around Greenwich Village. In the first boat is Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. And with him is a man named William Van Ness, his aide, later became a federal judge, and 4 oarsmen. Aaron Burr, Vice President, former United States Senator, former Attorney General of the state of New York, descendant of one of the most distinguished families in America. The second boat, Alexander Hamilton, described by many as the smartest of all the founding fathers. First Secretary of the Treasury, aide, confidant, chief advisor to George Washington for a quarter of a century, creator and principal contributor to the Federalist Papers, and leader of the ranking political party in the United States, the Federalist Party. With him was his aide, Nathaniel Pendleton, and a doctor, Dr. David Hosack, and 4 oarsmen. Where were they going? They were going to the same place, Weehawken, New Jersey, to engage in what was called an interview. Now, talk about perverted metaphors for a duel, but that was a term that was often used to describe a duel. Why were they going to New Jersey? It was outlawed in New York, New Jersey, and probably everywhere in all of the states at that time. New Jersey was less stringent on enforcing dueling than New York. It was about a 3-mile trip by boat, and they were going to the exact same place that Alexander Hamilton's oldest son, Philip Hamilton, had been killed in a duel just 2.5 years before. So, why? Why? Why was the Vice President of the United States and one of the foremost founding fathers going out to commit murder? Well, let's go back to the beginning. Alexander Hamilton, born in 1755, or as he would say, Hamilton, in 1757. And why did he defer his birth? It was suggested in part because Aaron Burr was born in 1756, and he wanted to describe himself as younger than Burr. He was born on the island of Nevis out of wedlock. His mother was a woman who was married, but the father was not her husband. That was a stigma that stuck with him for the rest of his life. John Adams called him that bastard brat, son of a Scotch peddler. Thomas Jefferson described him as, who would want that monstrous leader of this country to be that foreign bastard? Hamilton's early education is fuzzy and not necessarily extensive. It's suggested that he may have gone to a school in Nevis founded by some Sephardic Jews who were refugees from Brazil. Aaron Burr, born into a very distinguished family. His father was the president of Princeton. His father died shortly after Burr was born, and he was succeeded by Burr's grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, often referenced as the leading clergyman in the colonies. By the age of 3, Burr had lost his mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, grandparents, and he was shuttled around from place to place. But it didn't seem to stymie him, because at the age of 11, he applied for admission to Princeton. Not only was he young, but he was short. And they said, no go. So it didn't deter Burr. For the next 2 years, he studied the curriculum of the first two years at Princeton. Greek, Latin, Hebrew, epistemology, rhetoric, logic, whatever it was. And at 13, he reapplies to Princeton. But he says, I now am entitled to advanced standing. Princeton said, well, we won't give you 2 years, but we'll give you 1 year. So Burr at the age of 13, enters as a sophomore at Princeton, graduates at 16, and now what do? Well, if you go on to graduate studies, there's medicine or law or the ministry. We undertook the ministry for a year, didn't like it, and left. Hamilton. Hamilton's mother moved from Nevis to St. Croix when he was 10 years old, and that was the last he ever heard of from his father. His mother died shortly after he got there, so he was in effect an orphan. He was recruited to serve as an apprentice at a trading company in St. Croix when he was 11 or 12 years old, and suddenly he's dealing in all of this foreign currency and international trade, and the owner of the company, his name was Nicholas Kruger, said, "I've got a whiz-bang guy here." And he, along with a minister named Henry Knox, raised monies to send Hamilton to New York. So Hamilton goes to New York, and what does he do? He applies to Princeton. But he's got a different approach. He says, I'm here and I want to be advanced at my own pace. I don't want any traditional enrollment. When I feel that I've achieved this given level, I want to move on. Well, again, Princeton didn't cotton to that, so he applied to King's College, soon after known as Columbia University, and he did receive advanced standing. So here we have these two men in their at their advanced teens, both college graduates. And now what? Well, this is around 1775, and they're showing real loyalty to the crown and to Great Britain, to England. Except along came Lexington and Concord, and they switched their allegiance, and both of them became supporters of the Revolution. George Washington becomes head of the military, and Alexander Hamilton joins him. And after a while, Washington realizes the military genius of this man, and he advances him from a captain to a colonel. And as I said before, he becomes a very reliant and dependent upon Hamilton for the next 20-some years. But Hamilton wanted to do battle. He wanted to combat, and Washington said, no go, you're much more valuable here is in your advisory role. Burr, on the other hand, did engage in battles, and he was a successful military man. He joined Benedict Arnold at the time that Arnold was loyal to the Revolution, and in the Battle of Quebec, he was a significant figure. Washington recruited him for his staff, and after 10 days, threw him out. So the war continues, and Hamilton meets a young woman, Elizabeth Schuyler, who was the daughter of Philip Schuyler. Philip Schuyler was a very prominent New Yorker, and they gets married. He leaves the military for a brief time, but then returns. And in the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, Hamilton was a key strategist, joining with Lafayette and with Washington, and that campaign effectively ended the war. Although the peace treaty wasn't signed for another year and a half, that was really the meaningful termination of the conflict. Burr, on the other hand, had left the military, and he then married. He married a woman by the name of Theodosia Prevost, who was the widow of a British military officer, although there's every indication that they had an ongoing and intimate relationship long before her husband died. Burr was a well-known carouser, as was Hamilton. Burr decided that he wanted to become a lawyer, and so the requirement at the time was that you had to spend 3 years in the study of law with a mentor, and he persuaded the licensing group, CLE's here, maybe you can get us another credit if we run over time here. He persuaded them that not 3 years, only 6 months if you served in the military. They agreed, and so Burr's admitted. Hamilton grabbed onto that idea, and he, sometime later, said, that sounds good, and he was the beneficiary. So in the early 1780s, they both are lawyers, and they are viewed as probably the two most prominent lawyers in the city of New York, state of New York, and maybe even in the nation. They were often on opposite sides, but they were occasionally on the same side in significant cases. They then each were elected to the New York General Assembly and didn't have particularly prominent or distinguished roles there. But in 1786, Hamilton recognized that this country could probably not survive under the structure that it was then. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no central executive, there was no central judiciary, there was no capacity to tax, you had to rely on the whims of the states. And he, along with James Madison, decided that there should be a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton went to that. He was one of the 3 delegates from New York. His role at the Constitutional Convention was not significant. He made a 6-hour speech at the beginning, and then he lapsed into irrelevance. However, when the Constitutional Convention approved the Constitution, it then was to go to the states, and when 9 states approved it, the Constitution was ratified and was implemented. But even as Hamilton recognizes likely there will be 9 states, there were 2 states that were uncertain, 2 very key states, Virginia and New York. And so again, Hamilton gets a hold of Madison, and he recruits Madison and John Jay to write what's now known as the Federalist Papers. Jay wrote only 5 of the 85, became sick and had to leave. Madison wrote 29, and Hamilton wrote 51. These papers were not reflective of the political philosophy of Hamilton, Madison, or Jay. They were not reflective of any political party. They were the sound bites of the day. They were the advocacy for the ratification of the Constitution by the state, principally of New York, but also of Virginia. Hamilton alerted Madison that the moment that Virginia approves the Constitution, get word to me immediately, which would take several days, so I can try and persuade the New York delegation, which was clearly opposed to ratification, as much as 3-1. And Hamilton's brilliant advocacy resulted in New York adopting the Constitution by just 2 votes. So now Washington is elected president under the Electoral College unanimous. He decides to form a cabinet made up of state, treasury, and war. He asks Robert Morris, to be the Secretary of Treasury. And Morris says, I'm too embroiled in my own financial difficulties. I can't do it, but I recommend Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's in his early 30s. And Washington appoints Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson as Secretary of State. Those two agreed on nothing except Washington. They were in constant loggerheads. When Washington said, do I have authority to form a national bank? He asked Jefferson and Hamilton to each write position papers. And of course Jefferson said, no, you don't have the right. Hamilton said, yes, you do have the right. Washington followed Hamilton's, and the national bank so important to the strengthening of the faltering economy at that time. In the meantime, back to our friend Burr, he's appointed by the governor to be the Attorney General of the state of New York. And he does okay there. In 1791, Burr decides to run for the United States Senate from New York. The then senator is Philip Schuyler, the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. That Burr defeats Schuyler. In those days, it was the state legislatures that voted for the Senate. And that creates what I call tension number one between Hamilton and Burr. Burr goes into the Senate, and he doesn't particularly like it. He decides that when Gouverneur Morris stepped down as minister to France, that he'd like to be the minister to France. So he applies. Hamilton goes to work again and urges Washington not to appoint him. Tension number two. In 1794, Burr says, I still don't like the Senate. I'm going to run for governor of New York. Hamilton goes to work again. He persuades John Jay, enormously popular, to run for governor, and Burr has to step down. He realizes he can't win. Tension number three. 1796, Burr decides he's going to run for vice president of the United States. Now, at that time, the process was, under the Constitution, that the person who got the highest number of electoral votes was the president, and the person who got the second highest number was the vice president. You didn't run as a team. John Adams is running. This is the first election post-George Washington in which he was elected unanimously twice by the Electoral College. God willing, maybe we'll see that event happen again sometime. I think it'll take more than God. It'll take people going to the polls. But Burr, and again, Hamilton balks him. Tension number four. 1797. Burr is running again for the United States Senate, and he's running against Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father-in-law, who he defeated in 1791. This time Schuyler defeats him. Tension number five. In 1798, John Adams is president, and he asks, it looks like they're going to go to war with France. So he asks George Washington, would he assume leadership, the leader of the military? Washington was very comfortably ensconced at Mount Vernon, had no desires, no interest in that. Washington said to him, well, yes, I'll do it on one term. What's that, said Adams? That Alexander Hamilton is second in command. Well, here's Adams, who called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, but he wanted Washington. He said, okay. But Adams then said, I have a request. All right, said Washington, what's that? that Aaron Burr has a meaningful role in the military. And Washington says, no. What count are we at? What tension? 5? 6? Whatever. Tension. So he's defeated, and now Burr decides he's going to run for the New York State House. He's going from United States Senator to the New York State House. And he's elected. He serves there. In the meantime, Hamilton is practicing law and an important voice in public affairs. 1800. Jefferson is running against Adams for the presidency. Burr says to Jefferson, I can help you. You have strength in the South, in Virginia and others, but you need, New York would be very critical. I can help you deliver the electoral votes in New York. In those days, the legislature decided who the electors were. Now, Burr was a skilled, what I'd call, retail politician, unlike most of the others. He went out, knocked on doors, he went to rallies and so forth. Most of the elected public officials in those days just sat around and had their surrogates do it. It was considered in politics to go out and actually campaign. But Burr was effective. He did deliver. And then he said, okay, I want to be your vice president. So they ran. Now, the electors were instructed, for God's sakes, don't have Burr get the same number of electoral votes or more than Jefferson. You know, said, okay, yeah, we understand. So somebody has got to vote only for Jefferson. It didn't happen. The electoral vote, 73 for Jefferson, 73 for Burr. A tie. Now, the Constitution provides for that. And it says that in such an event, the House of Representatives selects the president. But here's the quirk. The House of Representatives, each state has one vote. Now, you can imagine today, if one of these candidates doesn't get a majority, that California with 54 congressmen and Wyoming with 1 congressman have the same one vote. So they put it to the House. In the meantime, Hamilton is now in a total dilemma. His despised opponent, Thomas Jefferson, and probably his equal despised opponent, Aaron Burr. What do? Sound familiar? 2 undesirable candidates? Well, let me give you instruction on what you should do. Do what Hamilton did. He said, I'm going to pick the person most qualified for the job. So he goes out and works hard to defeat Aaron Burr as President of the United States. Tension number, whatever number we're at, 7. And Burr becomes the vice president. Now, Burr as vice president was a pretty good vice president in his limited role. His role was to preside over the U.S. Senate. His 2 predecessors, John Adams was the first vice president, and Thomas Jefferson the second, were lousy vice presidents. They permitted anybody to do anything, all chaos. He put order and structure to it. But he knew Jefferson wasn't going to select him again for his running mate as vice president. So he goes back and he decides to run for governor of New York. Now Hamilton really goes to work and torpedoes his whole effort. At least Burr thought so. Burr was probably at that point pretty unpopular anyway, unlikely to be, but Burr always attributed his loss to Hamilton. So here we are, and during the election, Alexander Hamilton is in Albany, a place where he started to practice law, the state capital of New York, at a dinner party at the home of James Taylor. There were all kinds of prominent people there, but Hamilton was the star. And attending that dinner was James Taylor's son-in-law, Dr. Charles Cooper. And Cooper, some short time later, writes a letter. It's mysterious why he wrote it and to whom he wrote it, but it gets in the hands of a newspaper. And in that letter, he said that Hamilton described Burr as a dangerous person. That would be pretty polite and moderate in today's affairs, but then the editor of the paper runs into Philip Schuyler, the father-in-law, and says, "Hey, your son-in-law called Aaron Burr a dangerous person." Schuyler says, no, that couldn't have been. My son-in-law wouldn't have acted that way. I said, well, why don't you do something about it? So Schuyler writes a letter in a newspaper saying it wasn't true. Charles Cooper, who wrote the first letter, said, they're calling me a liar. Not only did he call him a dangerous person, but he said he has despicable opinions about Burr. 3 words, dangerous and despicable opinions. Burr, 2 months later, got word of this description by Charles Cooper. And so he recruits his friend William Van Ness, sends off a letter to Alexander Hamilton, and says, please explain what this is all about. Hamilton writes back, if you tell me more detail, I'll answer it, in 11 letters back and forth, resulting in the challenge to a duel. Now, dueling in Europe was a way of life. It was a class issue, though. The so-called upper class didn't duel with the lower class. They probably took their walking stick and whacked them over the head, and that was it. And it originally started with swords, but as gun technology improved, guns were more popular. Although the kind of things you could duel with, they dueled with not only swords, guns, but even billiard balls they dueled. Alexander Hamilton was opposed to dueling. He had written a letter not too long before the duel took place, in which he said 4 things. He said, my religion, he was an Episcopalian, prevents me from supporting dueling. My family, I have 7 kids and a wife, prevent me from dueling. I have creditors, and I have an obligation to discharge those debts, prevents me from dueling. And finally he said, which was somewhat surprising, I don't dislike Aaron Burr. I only dislike his politics. Well, then what compelled Hamilton, with all of this disclaimer of dueling, to go to a duel? Dueling in those days, if you were challenged, you didn't fail to agree to a duel. Alexander Hamilton, in fact, had been involved in 10 duels. Most of them, he was a second. None of them was a shot fired. It's like lawyers coming to the courthouse steps and settling their cases. The person who's, they say, okay, I'm sorry, and I won't do it again, and end of it. Abraham Lincoln was involved in a duel in which there were swords, and when his challenger saw the enormous arm spread of Lincoln, he said, I quit. Andrew Jackson was involved in 12 duels and bore a bullet in his lung the rest of his life, and he killed a man. So there was Hamilton. He couldn't avoid. It was a case of honor, and he said, I have to I have to go through with it. Otherwise, I will be called a coward all of my life, and my career will be over. So there they are at Weehawken, New Jersey, at 6:30 in the morning. Both arrived. They greeted each other. They cleared the area. The reason that it was so early was that the owner of the land knew that people had Duel there and didn't support it, so they wanted to do it before he discovered it. And then Hamilton had the right to choose the arms, the method that was used. He chose the pistols that had killed his son. And he had written the night before that he probably was going to shoot in the air and not shoot at Burr. And was never communicated to Burr. So they flipped a coin to see who faces what. Hamilton won, and oddly enough, he chose to look into the sun rather than to have his back to the sun. They chose a second coin, decide which of the seconds will utter the present charge. Hamilton won again, so his second announced present. It's unclear who shot first. Both sides maintain the other did, but it is clear that Hamilton's shot went way off. Burr's went right into his body, and Hamilton exclaimed, "I'm a dead man." Burr came forward to tend to Hamilton, and his second whipped him, said, "You've got to get out of here," immediately. He went back to New York. Hamilton died the next day. The eulogy was given by Gouverneur Morris, who had given the eulogy for George Washington, and Hamilton became a martyr and Burr a villain. But now what happens to Burr? The Vice President of the United States has committed murder. He goes to Philadelphia, and while he's there, he says, "Wait a minute. If I'm indicted and they extradite me, that is, to bring me back from Philadelphia to New York, I'll be in prison. There's no bail. I'll be in prison until there's a determination of this." So he runs off to South Carolina. He's fleeing. He then, New York and New Jersey both indict him, but the indictments are discharged. New Jersey says, well, he died in New York and therefore let New York handle it. And New York said, but the duel took place in New Jersey, let New Jersey handle it. And there was no charge. So he comes back, and he's now sitting as the Vice President of the United States, carrying out his term. And there comes before him the impeachment of Samuel Chase, Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, on what we can accurately call Whig charges, politics, where there was no basis for it. But the irony is, in an ordinary case, the murderer stands before the judge for disposition. Here you've got the judge standing before the murderer. And Burr carries out in a flawless manner his duties and then leaves. Now, there's subsequent activity of Burr, which I don't think we have time to dig, in which he's charged with treason and other, and then his career totally collapses. So what you have is this. You have Alexander Hamilton coming to this country, a penniless, illegitimate orphan with nothing, and he takes a country that doesn't have too much more, and with his genius makes it the most credit-worthy nation in the world within a matter of a few years. And you have Aaron Burr with that whole abundance of talent, whose career collapsed, and he was in complete obscurity. And my guess is most of us here don't know much more about him than he was in a duel with Alexander Hamilton. So the question we have to ask is, what if the duel hadn't taken place? What would the counterfactual historians say would have been the benefit and direction of this country if those two men were still able to serve their nation? Thank you. Kevin.
Morey, is there a policy or political philosophy issue below the surface that exacerbated those 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 issues of conflict between Burr and Hamilton?
Yeah, first of all, I gave 8. There could be 88 because the tensions were abundant, but those were the significant ones. There is philosophy in terms of Burr was described as a man with many talents, except the talent to use those talents. Hamilton was described as a strong centralist. One of the reasons was when he came as this country, he didn't have any particular allegiance to any state, like Jefferson did to Virginia. So he had a strong sense. He viewed Burr, as most people did, that Burr had no interest except self-interest. And this drove him crazy throughout. So it was that kind of personality conflict, even more than political, that Hamilton viewed Burr as an inappropriate public official and took him on at every point. So I think that was a major contributing factor to it. Yeah.
Morey.
Yeah, David.
When was dueling eventually banned? And did this have anything, when was dueling eventually banned? And did this have anything to do with the eventual banning of dueling?
No, David, dueling was banned before, as I said, before. And yet it was not observed. So that dueling at that time in both New York and New Jersey was prohibited. But they viewed New Jersey as much less inclined to enforce it. But it had been banned. For example, George Washington was a fierce opponent of dueling, as was Benjamin Franklin, the people that, so they knew. I mean, the irony is, the Vice President of the United States knew he was violating the law by getting on that boat and going to a duel. It had been banned in this country probably 30 years before the duel took place. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes. Yeah.
You offered the question, what would have happened if there had not been a duel? What would have happened if there had not been a duel? I'm sure you've thought of the answer.
Yeah.
What is your answer?
My answer is nothing. That's a smug, glib answer, but I think what had happened was Alexander Hamilton, in terms of his political direction, had been pretty much canceled out. He had too many enemies. He had written a paper criticizing John Adams right before Adams' re-election in 1800, called The Character and Conduct of John Adams, a 50-some page, for no reason. His enemies were Adams, Madison, Monroe, Jefferson, Burr. So he was neutralized out as a political figure, and he knew that. He knew that the Federalist Party, and then when he went out in support of Jefferson for president in 1804, that really did him in as a political figure. So he was going to be a private citizen. Burr had already been disclaimed because, as I said, everybody recognized Burr as a person who had no civic interest. He had only self-advancement, and he had run his course. So my answer is, although I posed the question, I come to a quick answer, wouldn't have made any difference. Yeah, Hal.
Morey, you mentioned that Washington took Burr into his command structure, but then 10 days later kicked him out.
Yeah.
He didn't say why. Why did he kick him out?
He was obnoxious. He was extremely difficult, and similarly, when some years later, when John Adams was saying, "I'd like to have Burr," you imposed on me Hamilton as second in command. I'd like to have Burr. Washington still retained that, and he couldn't stand him. Burr was as I said, he didn't have any acceptability as a genuine public servant. So Washington found him obnoxious from the word go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Everybody else?
Okay.
Wait, yes.
Morey, if Hamilton shot away from his target, let's say, was that customary to sometimes have a gentleman's agreement that they would both shoot away?
Yes, it was, and as I said, Hamilton had indicated that he was going to do that. He wrote, even as recent as the night before, that he was going to do it. So it was not uncommon for them to just say, "Hey, we have to play out the game of face saving, of not being faced with cowardice, but we'll run through it and we won't do anything." Now, the night before, let me ask you this question. The night before, Hamilton writes a letter, a very short letter, to a man by the name of Thomas Sedgwick, and he's urging Sedgwick to take an active role in preventing secession by the New England states. They were considering to secede. And he said that I'm urging you, it's no good for this country. But he said in that, the poison of this country is, what's the word that's the next word?
Slavery.
No.
Factionalism? Factionalism? Factionalism?
No. It'll stun you. Democracy. Now, let me just, the musical. You've heard the music. I haven't seen it, but I've read the libretto. I know a little bit about Hamilton, and I think the musical is spectacular. I think the genius of Lin-Manuel Miranda and how he was able in poetry and in rap to capture accuracy of the historical moments is amazing. There's a criticism by some, and the criticism is that even though almost all the performers, more over 90% of the performers in the musical are people of color, that there is no reference to any black character in that performance. They're not recognizing any blacks other than, as someone said, well, you're putting blacks in here as slave traders. Seems like it's Halloween, was the criticism. So there's not, they're saying, why didn't you recognize that there were people, blacks, African Americans, who made significant contributions during the Revolution? One criticism. The other is on what's called founders chic. A historian at the University of Texas, H.W. Brands, said, there is this glorification of the founding fathers. And who were they? They were slaveholders, they were misogynists, they abused Native Americans, they had very serious flaws, and yet we have such reference for them. So that Hamilton, who was an elitist, I mean, when he says the great poison of this country is democracy, that's a rather startling thing. He believed that the president should be elected for life, and he believed U.S. senators should be elected for life. So he talked about almost a monarchy kind of system. So that's something. Yeah, yeah, Sandra.
We're living in 2016, and some of us think it's as bad now as it's ever been, or even worse. The ill will in politics. Has it been this way somewhere between the founding years and now? I imagine there are plenty of incidents that show this kind of hostility.
The election of 1800 has been described as the most vulgar election in the history of American politics. That's Adams versus Jefferson. So there is, well, we have some history, we have some tradition of it. I think.
Lincoln's time was pretty bad, wasn't it?
Yeah, in Lincoln's time also. So it's not
Not that it's any.
not any reassurance. No, no.
But we do have that history.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What were the circumstances of his son's duel? I had heard it was in defense of Hamilton, but I never...
Yeah. His son, a young lawyer, had made some disparaging statements about Hamilton. Hamilton's son, Philip, is only, I think, 20 years old, and another person confronted him in a public place about that. So he challenged them both to a duel. The first duel with his friend resulted in nobody being injured, and the second one was, but yes, his son was in defense of Hamilton. Yeah. Ro?
To follow up on Sandra's question, the Lincoln election and that campaign was ugly. The campaign we're going through at the moment is certainly the ugliest I have ever experienced in any country in the world in terms of insults and things and division of the country. It took almost however many years you want to put on it for the country to come together again following the Lincoln election. Where do we go from here?
Well, we deal with campaign financing. We deal with shorter elections. We try and create more enthusiasm in the electorate. But you're doing a pretty good job of helping us do that. So those are just some of the things that we can do. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Morey, for another stimulating and insightful lecture. We'll look forward to many more from you. And speaking of many more, on Sandra's behalf, I'll point out that on October 18th, we're going to hear about Crime Online, the investigation and prosecution of cyber criminals that is going to be presented by our own Judge Thomas Vineski of the United States Third Circuit Court of Appeals. It will be in Reddington Hall in Collegiate, which is the thing up at the top of the hill. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Morey, for a great speech. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.